This is a story about time, something we take for granted until there's almost none left. About the words we postpone, the chances we let slip away, and the moments that vanish before we realize their worth. But is it possible to live a whole life when time is running out? Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe. It takes just a second for you but means the world to me. When Michael stepped out of the doctor's office, the world around him seemed to lose its clarity. The cars sped past, people walked by, conversations filled the air, but everything suddenly felt distant and insignificant, like a backdrop in a play. He kept moving forward mechanically, unaware of the changing traffic lights, the faces of the pedestrians, or the street musicians playing around the corner. His mind kept replaying the words the doctor had said, over and over again. Inoperable tumor. 8 weeks. 8 weeks. That number echoed in his head, pulsing in his temples, sitting like a heavy weight in his chest. The thought of death had always lingered somewhere in the background of his consciousness, abstract and distant, something that happened to others but never to him. But now, inevitability had become his reality. The walk home took longer than usual. Or maybe it just felt that way because every step stretched out into an eternity. When he finally opened the door to his apartment, the emptiness inside greeted him with a cold silence. It had always been quiet here, but today the silence felt different. It was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of the end. He sat down on the edge of his bed and stared at a blank spot on the wall. How many times had he postponed the important things in life, thinking there would always be time? How many times had he told himself he would call his father someday, that he would mend their broken relationship when the right moment came? How many times had he thought about explaining to Sarah why he had walked away, but convinced himself that there was no rush? Now, time was no longer something he could afford to waste. He reached for his phone, scrolling slowly through the list of contacts. There were so many names, some he hadn't spoken to in months, others in years. Then he saw it. His father. Michael stared at the name on the screen. The number hadn't changed in all these years, just like the man it belonged to. Stern, proud, and unyielding. His father had never been one to forgive easily. They hadn't spoken in 5 years. He didn't need to remember their last conversation in detail. The anger, the raised voices, the accusations were still fresh in his memory. The day he walked out, slamming the door behind him, he had been certain he would never return. He had convinced himself that some things were too broken to be fixed. But now there was no more time for pride. His hands trembled slightly as he pressed the call button. The ringing felt endless. Hello. The voice was deep, slightly rough. It took a second before recognition settled in. Michael closed his eyes. It's me. There was silence on the other end of the line. Michael. His father's voice was sharp, carrying a mix of surprise and wariness. More silence followed. 5 years. How much pain had filled those years? That. Another pause stretched between them, heavier than words. Where are you? His father finally asked, his tone unreadable. At home. Why are you calling? Michael could have told him the truth. He could have simply exhaled and said, because I'm dying. But he didn't. I want to see you. The silence returned, but this time it felt different, laced with hesitation. Then finally, his father spoke again. Tomorrow evening. The line went dead. Michael slowly placed the phone down beside him. For now, this was enough. The next morning, he left home early, but despite the hour, the city was already alive. He bought a cup of coffee on the way, took a sip and realized he couldn't taste it. His mind was elsewhere. When he finally reached the old house where he had grown up, his heart pounded faster. It looked exactly the same brick walls, the same windows that glowed warmly in the evenings. It was strange how a place could stay unchanged while the person standing before it had become someone entirely different. Michael took a deep breath, lifted his hand and knocked. He heard footsteps inside. The door creaked open. His father stood before him. The years had left their mark. His face had grown thinner, his hair had turned grayer, and his eyes had lost some of their sharpness, but there was still something unshakable about him, something that had always felt carved from stone. For a moment they simply looked at each other. "Can I come in?" Michael finally asked. His father didn't answer but stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The house smelled the same. The familiar scent of aged wood, books, and faint traces of coffee lingered in the air, bringing back memories of childhood. Everything was as it had been before he left, every piece of furniture in its place, every photograph hanging on the walls exactly where it had always been. They sat down at the dining table. His father poured himself a cup of tea but didn't extend the offer to Michael. His hands rested on the table, steady and strong, just as they had always been. The silence between them was heavy. There was too much time between now and the last time they had spoken. Too many unspoken words standing in the way. Michael ran his fingers over the wooden surface of the table, lowering his gaze. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. His father didn't move. Michael didn't try to explain what exactly he was apologizing for. Was it for leaving? For the years of silence? For the way they had both let their pride get in the way of something that should have never been broken? His father held his gaze for a long time, as if weighing his words. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. And that was enough. When Michael stepped out into the night air, the city stretched before him, full of life, oblivious to what had just happened behind that door. The air felt lighter, clearer. He pulled his phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen. One new message. "Did you call me yesterday?" His chest tightened. "Sarah." He gripped the phone a little tighter, hesitating for only a moment before unlocking the screen. Among the many names on his list, hers was the next one he had to face. The night air was cool, carrying the distant hum of the city, where life continued as if nothing had changed. Cars rushed past, their headlights cutting through the darkness, and neon signs flickered above quiet storefronts. People moved through the streets, unaware that someone had just received the worst news of their life. Michael stood in front of the apartment door that he had not approached in 5 years. He stared at the numbers on the plaque, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edges, as if confirming to himself that this was real. He had spent years convincing himself that his father would outlive him, that the man behind this door would always be there, unyielding, proud, impossible to reach. The cruel irony was that now, when time was no longer on his side, he had finally gathered the courage to stand here. Taking a slow breath, he knocked. Footsteps echoed on the wooden floor inside. His heart pounded harder with every step approaching the door. Then came the familiar metallic click of the lock turning, followed by the quiet creak of hinges as the door swung open. His father stood in the doorway, looking at him with unreadable eyes. Michael had expected anger, had braced himself for bitterness, but instead there was only silence. The man before him had changed. The sharp lines of his face had deepened, his frame had grown leaner, his hair now more gray than dark. But the weight in his gaze was the same, steady, questioning, waiting. Michael forced himself to hold that gaze. "Can I come in?" His father didn't reply but stepped aside, giving him space to enter. The apartment had not changed in 5 years. The same old books filled the shelves, the same wooden table stood in the kitchen, and the familiar scent of freshly brewed tea lingered in the air. The photographs on the wall had not been moved, including the one of his mother, frozen in time with her warm, laughing eyes. Michael stood awkwardly in the hallway, as if he were stepping into a past life, one that he no longer belonged to. His father took a seat at the table without a word. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not hostile, but it was filled with the weight of time lost. Michael sat across from him, his fingers idly tracing the grain of the wooden surface, as he had done so many times as a child when his father used to sit in that same chair, teaching him how to tie a fishing knot or fix a broken radio. Everything between them had shattered long ago, but sitting here now, Michael realized that the pieces had never been thrown away. They had only been gathering dust. His father poured himself tea, taking slow, deliberate sips. It was a habit he had never changed, one of the many things Michael used to resent but now found oddly comforting. His father finally broke the silence, his voice steady, but quieter than he remembered. "You look tired." Michael almost laughed. Tired? The understatement of a lifetime. He swallowed hard before answering. "A lot has happened." His father simply nodded. They weren't ready for explanations, and maybe they never would be. Some things were too painful to say out loud. Michael's gaze drifted toward the wall, where a faded photograph of the three of them still hung. His mother, younger than he had ever truly known her, with her arms wrapped around him as a child. His father stood beside her, his hand resting on his shoulder. They looked like a family that belonged together. He wanted to say something about her, about how much he missed her, about how he had spent years avoiding thinking about her because it hurt too much. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he spoke the only words that truly mattered now. "I'm sorry." His father didn't react at first. He sat still, his expression unreadable, as if weighing whether or not to accept the apology. Then after a long pause he nodded. It was the smallest gesture, barely noticeable, but to Michael it was everything. They ate dinner together in silence, the way they used to when words felt unnecessary. The food was simple, but it was warm, and Michael realized how long it had been since someone had cooked for him. Later that night, his father pulled an old photo album from the shelf and set it between them on the table. The cover was worn, the pages slightly bent at the corners from years of being flipped through. Michael hesitated before opening it. The first page showed his mother standing in the backyard, her arms stretched out as if inviting them both into her embrace. The second was of him, no older than 6, sitting on his father's shoulders, his small hands gripping his hair as he grinned at the camera. The pages turned slowly, revealing frozen moments of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Birthdays, baseball games, fishing trips. A past that had slipped through his fingers like sand. When he reached a picture of himself at 10 years old, gripping a baseball bat too big for his hands, he stopped. His father stood beside him in the photo, his hand guiding his grip. Michael remembered that day. He had been too scared to swing, too afraid of missing. But his father had crouched beside him and said, "Don't be afraid to fail. Be afraid not to try." He had forgotten that moment. Or maybe he had buried it under years of resentment. Now sitting here he realized something. His father had always been there. Even when he had been too young to understand it. Even when he had walked away. Michael closed the album, running his fingers over the cover before looking up. His father was already watching him. No words were spoken, but none were needed. By the time Michael left the apartment, night had fully settled over the city. The streets were nearly empty, the air crisp with the promise of winter. He felt lighter. Not because the weight of everything had disappeared, but because for the first time in years, he had taken a step toward healing something that had once felt irreparable. As he walked toward the subway, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A new message. "Did you call me yesterday?" His breath caught for a moment as he stared at the name. Sarah. His fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to respond immediately, or let it sit a little longer. But deep down he already knew what came next. She was the next chapter he needed to face. Michael sat in his apartment long after midnight, the soft glow of the city casting moving shadows on the ceiling. His phone rested beside him, the message from Sarah still open on the screen. "Did you call me yesterday?" He had read those 4 words over and over again, but he hadn't found the courage to respond. He had expected this moment to feel different. Maybe lighter, maybe heavier. But now that it was here, he realized he didn't know what to say. It had been 4 years since he last saw her. 4 years since he made the biggest mistake of his life. Sarah had been the one constant in his world, the only person who had truly seen him, understood him, loved him despite all the walls he had built around himself. And he had walked away from her without a single explanation. At the time, he had told himself it was the right decision. He had been afraid of love, afraid of commitment, afraid of losing himself in something so real that it terrified him. He had convinced himself that leaving her was an act of mercy, that she deserved better than him. But now, as the clock ticked relentlessly forward, as time continued to slip through his fingers, he knew that nothing he told himself back then had been true. She had been the best thing in his life, and he had thrown it away. Now, with weeks left to live, he could no longer afford to hide from the past. He needed to see her, not to ask for forgiveness, not to reclaim what they had lost, but simply to let her know that he had never stopped loving her. The cafe was still exactly as he remembered it. A small corner shop tucked away on a quiet street, the scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries spilling out onto the sidewalk. The last time he had been here, he had been with her. They had sat at their usual table near the window, fingers laced together as they talked about nothing and everything. That day had been ordinary, and yet, looking back now, it had been the kind of moment he should have held on to forever. He stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the cafe wrap around him. She was there, standing behind the counter, jotting down an order in her worn notebook, her dark hair tied up in a loose ponytail the way she always wore it when she was working. She looked almost the same, but there was something different in her eyes. Something older, something quieter. She didn't see him at first. But then as she turned, her gaze landed on him, and she froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Michael braced himself for anger, for disbelief, for something sharp and cutting. But all he saw in her expression was hesitation, a flicker of something unspoken. She didn't look away. He took a deep breath and walked forward. He sat at the same table they used to share, waiting. She moved behind the counter, working, keeping herself busy, but he could see the way her hands trembled slightly as she set down cups, the way her gaze flickered toward him when she thought he wasn't looking. When she finally approached, she placed a cup of coffee in front of him, the same order he used to get. Neither of them spoke at first. Michael wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic, staring at the dark liquid inside. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsed the words he might say, but now that she was sitting across from him, every scripted sentence felt wrong. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "You look different." Her voice was soft, but there was something firm underneath it, something guarded. Michael swallowed, knowing she was right. He had changed. Not just physically, though the exhaustion in his body was harder to hide these days, but something deeper. The sharp edges of who he had been worn down, softened by the weight of everything he now carried. He wanted to tell her why he had left. He wanted to tell her that he regretted it every single day, that he had spent years pretending he didn't miss her when, in reality, every part of him ached for what they had lost. But instead he just nodded. "Yeah." She studied him for a long moment, and he wondered if she could see through him, if she already knew that something was wrong. She had always been able to read him better than anyone. "You called me," she finally said. Michael let out a slow breath. "Yeah." Her fingers curled slightly against the tabletop. Why? He could have lied. Could have told her that it was just an impulse, that he had been feeling nostalgic, that there was no real reason. But there was no point in lying anymore. His chest felt tight, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. "Because I couldn't leave without seeing you again." Something flickered in her expression. She didn't ask what he meant by leave. Maybe she was afraid of the answer. Or maybe deep down she already knew. She exhaled slowly, looking away for a moment, as if trying to gather her thoughts. When she looked back at him, her eyes were softer, but there was sadness there too. "You could have come back sooner." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Michael's throat tightened. "I know." They sat in silence. The air between them was thick with everything they weren't saying, with the weight of all the lost years, the missed chances, the unspoken words. He wished he could go back and rewrite their story. He wished he could give her all the time they had lost. But he couldn't. All he had was now. By the time he left the cafe, the sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. His chest ached, but for the first time in a long time it wasn't just from the sickness. He had seen her. And even if it wasn't enough, even if it didn't change the past, at least she knew. As he walked home, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message. "Same time tomorrow?" Michael stared at the screen, his heart hammering in his chest. She hadn't forgiven him. Not yet. But she wasn't ready to say goodbye either. And that was enough. Michael had never been to Paris, though he had dreamed of it since childhood. He remembered tracing his finger over a map when he was young, imagining himself walking through the streets of this city, drinking coffee at a small Parisian cafe, listening to street musicians, standing on a bridge over the Seine and watching the sunset paint the water in golden hues. But dreams had remained just dreams. He had always found excuses. Work, a lack of time, other obligations. Now, with time slipping away from him faster than ever before, he could no longer afford to put things off. He bought a ticket, packed a small bag, and headed to the airport without hesitation. This time, fear would not hold him back. In the departure hall, he watched people rushing to their flights, some returning home, others setting off on long-awaited journeys. All of them were thinking about tomorrow, about their plans for next week, for next month. He, on the other hand, knew that for him, every day was not just a date on a calendar, but a piece of time that he would never get back. The plane took off smoothly. He gazed out of the window, watching as New York faded into the distance, swallowed by the clouds. Everything that had once seemed important now felt distant and unimportant. All that mattered was what lay ahead. Paris greeted him with crisp spring air and a light drizzle. The narrow streets glistened after the rain, carrying the scent of fresh bread and coffee. He walked slowly along the cobblestone roads, listening to the hum of the city, the quiet conversations of passers-by, the music drifting from nearby cafes. Everything was just as he had imagined, but now it was real. It was no longer just an idea, a dream left for someday. He could feel it in every breath, in every step, in every small detail that made up the soul of the city. He wasn't in a hurry. There was no checklist of tourist attractions he needed to see. He just wanted to be here, to soak in the atmosphere, to feel for the first time in a long time that he was truly living. As he walked through Place du Tertre, he saw street artists painting portraits of strangers. Their confident strokes brought faces to life on canvases in a matter of minutes. He stopped, watching an elderly man sketch a woman's face with swift, practiced movements. The moment would soon pass. The portrait would be taken away. But for now, it was frozen in time. Michael thought about what would remain of him when he was gone. Would anyone remember his face, his voice, the way he laughed? Would he leave anything behind that wouldn't fade as quickly as a charcoal sketch on a rainy afternoon? Continuing his walk, he reached the banks of the Seine. The water flowed steadily, reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. He leaned against the stone railing of the bridge and looked down, watching as ripples formed on the surface. When he was a child, he had imagined this exact moment, standing here, watching the river, feeling the wind on his face, listening to the distant melody of French music drifting from a cafe. Now that it was real, something inside him clenched. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't regret. It was the quiet acceptance that this was both a beginning and an ending. That evening, he climbed the steps of Montmartre to see the city from above. The streets twisted beneath him, bustling with life, as artists sketched. Cafes overflowed with conversation, and the air smelled of fresh pastries. When he finally reached the top, Paris unfolded before him in all its beauty. Streetlights flickered to life, cars moved along the winding roads, casting reflections on the wet pavement. In the distance, Notre Dame stood solemn and unwavering, while the Eiffel Tower rose above it all, a symbol of something timeless and unbreakable. He sat on a stone bench, breathing in the cool air, feeling a peaceful exhaustion settle over him. For the first time since his diagnosis, he didn't feel fear. He didn't fear that his life was ending. He didn't fear leaving, because at least for today he had lived. Back in his hotel room, he dropped his bag onto the bed and sat down, leaning against the headboard. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the pictures he had taken that day, each one a small proof that he had been here, that this moment had been real. Then he noticed a new message. "How was your trip?" "The sender, Sarah." Michael stared at the screen, his fingers tightening slightly around the phone. She had been thinking about him. She had been waiting for a reply. For a long moment he hesitated. Then he slowly began to type. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, that didn't matter, because finally he had no regrets. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet pavement and the distant aroma of freshly brewed coffee from a shop down the street. The world around him remained unchanged, but something within Michael had shifted. Ever since his return from Paris, an unfamiliar lightness had settled in his chest, a stark contrast to the weight he had carried for so long. Fulfilling his childhood dream had granted him a moment of clarity, a rare sense of peace. But it had also left behind a void, a question lingering in his mind that refused to disappear. What now? His remaining time was slipping away, yet he no longer feared the passing days. He had made peace with the inevitable, but there was still something unfinished. Someone. Sarah. Her message had lingered in his thoughts ever since he received it. She had reached out first, even after everything. That had to mean something, didn't it? He wanted to believe that it did. Michael had spent years running from his feelings, convincing himself that love was a burden he wasn't capable of carrying. Now, standing on the edge of his own mortality, he realized just how wrong he had been. Love wasn't a burden. It was the only thing that truly mattered. And if he had only a handful of days left, he wanted to spend them with her. He didn't tell her he was coming. It wasn't because he feared rejection. It was because he wanted to see if she would still look at him the same way she once had. Before the mistakes, before the silence, before everything fell apart. The small cafe was just as he had left it, a place untouched by time. The wooden tables, the scent of warm pastries, the quiet hum of conversation. It all felt painfully familiar, yet somehow distant. And then he saw her. She stood behind the counter, speaking with a customer, her dark hair falling over her shoulder as she scribbled something in a notepad. For a brief moment, he considered walking away, sparing them both the pain of what was coming. But then her gaze lifted, and their eyes met. She didn't move. Michael took a step forward, and then another. His presence wasn't a surprise this time. There was no shock, no hesitation in her expression, just something quiet and unreadable, something that made his chest tighten. She didn't greet him. She didn't ask why he was here. Instead, she simply poured a cup of coffee, just as she had done countless times before, and placed it on the counter in front of him. Without a word, he took it and walked to the table near the window, their table. It wasn't until several minutes had passed that she finally sat across from him. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried the weight of 4 years of absence. For years of things left unsaid. Sarah folded her hands in her lap, her fingers lightly tapping against her knee, a nervous habit he still remembered. Michael watched her, memorizing every small detail. The way her lashes fluttered when she blinked, the curve of her lips when she was lost in thought, the way her shoulders tensed slightly, as if she was holding back words she wasn't sure she was ready to say. She was different, not in any drastic way, but in a way that time inevitably changes people. There was something more guarded about her now, something heavier in the way she carried herself. Finally she spoke. "You're different." It wasn't a question. Michael nodded. "So are you." She exhaled slowly, shifting her gaze to the cup in front of her. "What happened to you?" The question was inevitable, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to answer it. He could have told her about the sickness, about the cruel trick fate had played on him, about the countdown that now defined his days. But somehow, that wasn't what this moment was about. Instead, he said, "I learned what matters." Her fingers twitched slightly, but she didn't look up. "And what is that?" Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his voice steady despite the emotions pulling at him from all sides. "You." Her breath hitched, but she remained silent. She didn't cry. She didn't get angry. She didn't ask why it had taken him so long to realize what she had known all along. She simply looked at him, and in that gaze he saw everything. The love that had never truly left, the pain of his absence, the fear of letting him in again, only to lose him all over again. He wanted to promise her forever, but forever was no longer something he could offer. So instead, he said the only thing he knew was true. "I don't have much time left, Sarah. But whatever time I do have, I want to spend it with you." She inhaled sharply, as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. For a brief moment, she looked away, blinking rapidly. Then, without a word, she reached across the table and took his hand in hers. Her fingers were warm, grounding him in the present, in this moment that was theirs alone. She didn't ask how long he had. She didn't need to. All that mattered was that he was here now. And for the first time in years, Michael allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The wind carried the last traces of autumn, sweeping golden leaves across the pavement as the city prepared for winter's arrival. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, making the world feel quieter, softer, almost as if it was holding its breath. Michael moved slowly, his body no longer as strong as it had been just weeks ago. Fatigue clung to his limbs, an ever-present reminder that time was slipping away. He had always assumed he would recognize the moment when his body truly began to fail him. But the realization came gradually, creeping into his bones with each passing day. But despite the exhaustion, despite the weight pressing against his ribs, he felt something close to peace. Sarah had not let go of his hand since the night he told her the truth. She didn't cry in front of him, nor did she ask for more time than he could give. She simply stayed, her presence steady and unwavering, grounding him in the present moment. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt like he wasn't alone. But there was still something left to do. He had never been to the small community center tucked away between two old brick buildings. It wasn't a place he had ever needed before, but after reading about it in the newspaper one morning, he couldn't stop thinking about it. It was a home for children who had none, a shelter for those abandoned, lost, forgotten by the world. Michael had spent most of his life running from love, from commitment, from responsibility. He had convinced himself that he wasn't the kind of person who could take care of others. But now, standing in the quiet hallway of this place, he wondered if that had ever really been true. A woman greeted him, her warm smile full of something he hadn't seen in a long time: hope. She didn't ask too many questions, didn't press for details about why he had suddenly decided to be here. She simply led him into a brightly lit room, where laughter filled the air, untainted by the burdens of the outside world. The children were small, fragile, yet so full of life that it almost hurt to look at them. They didn't know who he was and they didn't care. They welcomed him the way only children could, without judgment, without hesitation, without the weight of expectations. He spent hours with them, reading stories, helping them with puzzles, listening to their excited chatter. For a little while, he forgot about the ticking clock inside him. And then, just as he was about to leave, a small girl with dark curls tugged at his sleeve. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Michael's breath caught in his throat. There was no malice in her question, no expectation, just the pure, innocent belief that the people who cared about you would always return. He knelt beside her, forcing a smile despite the ache deep in his chest. "I promise." It was the first time in his life he had ever made a promise he knew he couldn't keep. That night, as he lay in bed, sleep eluded him. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of moments he never thought he would get. Reconciliation, love, peace, but still there was something missing. He didn't want to leave Sarah with nothing. She had given him a second chance, had chosen to stand beside him even knowing how this story would end. She deserved something more than memories. So before dawn, he picked up a notebook, flipped to the first blank page and began to write. The words poured from him without hesitation, spilling onto the pages faster than he could think. He wrote about his childhood, about his mother's laughter and his father's silent strength. He wrote about the years he had wasted, the regrets that clung to him even now. He wrote about Paris, about the way the light hit the Seine at sunset, about the feeling of finally seeing a dream come to life. And most of all, he wrote about her, about how she had always been his home, even when he was too afraid to admit it, about how he had loved her long before he ever said the words out loud, about how, even in the end, she had made him feel like his life had meant something. By the time he finished, the sky outside was beginning to lighten. the first hints of morning creeping over the horizon. His hands trembled as he closed the notebook, tying it shut with a thin ribbon. On the cover, he carefully wrote just one name: Sarah. The world was still quiet when he stepped out onto the street, the chill of the morning biting at his skin. Sarah's apartment was only a few blocks away, but the walk felt longer than usual. He moved slower now, each step a little more difficult than the last, but he forced himself forward. By the time he reached her doorstep, the city had begun to wake. He hesitated for only a moment before placing the notebook down, tucking it carefully beneath the small flower pot beside her door. He knew she would find it. He didn't knock. He didn't wait. He simply turned and walked away. She would read it in the morning. She would know everything he had never been able to say out loud. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The evening air carried a lingering chill, the remnants of a city slowly descending into winter. Streetlights flickered against the darkening sky, illuminating the sidewalks where pedestrians hurried past, wrapped in scarves and lost in their own worlds. Life in New York went on as if nothing had changed. But for Michael, everything had changed. He had spent the past 24 hours waiting. Not in the way people wait for a bus or for the coffee to brew, but in the way a man waits for something inevitable, something irreversible. He hadn't received a message, hadn't gotten a call. There had been nothing but silence, and in that silence, his mind had been loud. Had she read it? Had she even found it? Had she sat down and flipped through the pages of his final confession? Or had she seen his name on the cover and left it untouched, unwilling to reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal? The buzzing of his phone startled him from his thoughts. He hesitated for a long moment before glancing at the screen. Sarah. His throat tightened. His fingers hovered over the answer button, suddenly unsure. Then he pressed it. Hello, he said, his voice quieter than he intended. For a moment, there was only breathing on the other end of the line. Then finally she spoke. I read it. Michael closed his eyes, exhaling through his nose. He had prepared for this. Yet hearing her voice filled with so much emotion made it harder than he had anticipated. I wanted you to know, he said. You should have told me in person. Her words weren't sharp, but they carried a weight that made his chest tighten. He let out a slow breath, gripping the phone tighter. I was afraid if I saw you, I wouldn't be able to leave. Silence stretched between them, heavy and filled with unspoken emotions. Then she asked the question he had been dreading. How much time do you have left? Michael looked up at the night sky, at the stars barely visible through the glow of the city lights. A week, maybe less. She inhaled sharply. For a moment, he thought the call had disconnected. But then, in a voice that barely reached his ears, she whispered, Where are you? His lips parted, but no words came out. Michael, she pressed more urgently this time. Where are you? 15 minutes later, she found him sitting on a bench in the park, wrapped in his coat, his hands buried in his pockets. He had chosen this place for a reason. It was where they had shared their first kiss. He hadn't thought about it in years, but now, at the end of everything, memories surfaced like whispers from the past, refusing to be ignored. Sarah stopped a few feet away from him, her arms wrapped around herself, her breath visible in the cold air. For a long moment she didn't move. Then slowly, she stepped forward and sat beside him. Michael didn't turn to look at her. He didn't need to. He could feel her presence, solid and unwavering, just as he remembered. You should be angry, he murmured. I am. Then why are you here? She let out a quiet, shaky laugh. But it wasn't one of amusement. It was the kind of laugh that escapes when emotions are too heavy to carry. Because I love you, you idiot. Michael swallowed against the lump in his throat. He hadn't expected those words. Not now. Not after everything. She let out a slow breath, shaking her head. I don't know what's worse, she continued. The fact that you're dying, or the fact that you thought I wouldn't want to spend your last days with you. He finally turned to look at her. Tears clung to her lashes, but she didn't cry. Not yet. I didn't want to hurt you, he admitted. You didn't want to hurt me? She repeated, her voice trembling. Do you know how much worse it would have been if you had just disappeared without telling me? If I had found out when it was too late? Michael clenched his jaw, guilt settling deep in his chest. I didn't know how to say goodbye. Sarah shook her head, gripping his hand, her fingers tight and desperate. Then don't. His breath hitched. Sarah, don't say goodbye, she interrupted, her voice cracking. Just stay. Stay with me for however long you can. Michael's vision blurred. The weight of her words, of this moment, pressed down on him harder than any pain he had felt before. And then, unable to fight it any longer, he pulled her into his arms. She clung to him as if she could hold him together, as if she could will the universe to change its course. But they both knew the truth. Time was merciless, and they didn't have enough of it. But in that moment, as they held on to each other under the quiet glow of the streetlights, time didn't matter. Nothing else mattered. They had now. And for now, that was enough. The night was fading, dissolving into the soft, fragile quiet of early morning. Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm. Cars rumbled in the distance, footsteps echoed along empty sidewalks, and neon lights flickered in half-lit windows. The world was awake, unaware that for someone, time was running out. Sarah had barely slept. She lay beside Michael, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, counting each breath as if memorizing the pattern, as if afraid there would be one less the next time she looked. His skin was paler than it had been the night before, his body thinner, his presence in the room growing fainter. She wasn't ready. She had told herself over and over again that she wouldn't let him see her fall apart. But now, as she lay beside him, her fingers tracing the lines of his knuckles, she knew there was no preparing for this. Because love was cruel. It gave you everything and then demanded you learn how to live without it. The morning light slipped through the curtains, casting golden streaks across the floorboards. Michael stirred beside her, a quiet sigh escaping his lips. Sarah sat up, watching as his eyes fluttered open. For a moment he just looked at her, his gaze soft and unreadable, as if memorizing her face. Then slowly, a faint smile appeared on his lips. "You're still here," he murmured, his voice weaker than before. She let out a quiet laugh, but it broke at the edges, trembling like glass. "Of course I'm here." Michael nodded slightly, his fingers reaching for hers. "I love you," he whispered. Sarah squeezed his hand, pressing her forehead against his. "I love you too," she breathed. "Always." His fingers trembled against hers. His breathing slowed. And in that moment, she realized he was slipping away. She felt the panic rise inside her chest, sharp and suffocating like drowning in air. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Just a little longer." Michael exhaled softly, his grip tightening for just a second before it weakened again. "I'm so tired, Sarah." Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. "I know," she whispered. She pressed a kiss to his temple, feeling the warmth of his skin, knowing that soon it would be gone. Michael took one last slow breath. And then there was silence. A silence so deep, so absolute that it swallowed everything. Sarah held on to him long after his body had gone still. She didn't sob. She didn't scream. She just sat there, her fingers curled around his, memorizing the shape of his hand, the weight of his presence, as if she could somehow keep him here a little longer. But there was no stopping time. There never had been. The days after his death passed in a blur. She moved through them in fragments, answering quiet phone calls, signing paperwork, standing in rooms filled with murmured condolences and meaningless words. She didn't cry at the funeral. She stood beside his father, feeling his quiet grief echoing her own. The two of them had barely spoken before Michael's illness, but in the end, they had both loved him in different ways. And now they were left with the same unbearable emptiness. After the last person had left, after the flowers had begun to wilt, Sarah sat alone in the small apartment where Michael had spent his last weeks. The space felt hollow without him. The world itself felt different. And then she saw it. His notebook. The one he had left for her. With shaking hands, she untied the ribbon, carefully opening the first page. "Sarah, I don't know if there's a right way to say goodbye. I don't think I ever learned how. But I don't want you to remember me with sadness. I don't want to be just another painful loss. I want you to remember the laughter, The stupid inside jokes. The way you always knew what I was thinking before I even said a word. I want you to remember the way we loved each other. Even when I was too scared to admit it. I want you to keep living. Really living. The way I should have when I had the chance. I want you to go places you've never been. Try things you never thought you'd try. Let yourself fall in love again, even if it's terrifying. Especially if it's terrifying. And when you think of me, don't think of the ending. Think of Paris. Think of that night in the cafe when we sat in silence and it was enough. Think of this moment right now as you're reading this, knowing that I loved you until my last breath. Because I did. I do. And I always will. Michael. Sarah pressed the notebook to her chest, closing her eyes as a sob tore through her. It hurt. God, it hurt. But in the middle of all that pain there was love. Still there. Still unbroken. She wasn't ready to say goodbye. Maybe she never would be. But she would keep going. For him. For them. For the love that would never die. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so you don't miss more heartwarming stories.